right there. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all there. I'm Nancy White, and I'm the Education Chair for the San Diego County Breastfeeding Coalition. I want to welcome you to the first of our World Breastfeeding Week National Breastfeeding Month webinars. Before COVID-19, as you remember, probably, we presented a 3 to 4 hour seminar in live person webinar every Saturday, the first Saturday in August. As we can't see your smiling faces all together this year, we have substituted 5 separate 1 hour webinars on current important topics in breastfeeding each Saturday in August and also September 5th. All of them, except for this one, will be at 10 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time. This one, we felt it was really cruel to get Carol up at 5 o'clock in the morning on Sunday in New Zealand. So we gave her a couple of hours more sleep. As you may be aware, the theme for World Breastfeeding Week is Support Breastfeeding for a Healthier Planet. To support that theme, we're starting with a very special speaker from New Zealand, Carol Bartle. Carol was awarded the Queen's Birthday honor this year for services to health and breastfeeding education. Carol has a nursing, midwifery, and lactation consultant background, a postgraduate diploma in child advocacy, and a Master of Health Sciences. Carol's research thesis explored the experiences of initiating and maintaining lactation and establishing breastfeeding in a neonatal intensive care unit environment. Carol has worked on a number of major projects, including the development of 10 steps for the protection, promotion, and support of breastfeeding in early childhood education, a literature review for the business case for an NICU milk bank, and in Christchurch. Her major interests include infant and young child feeding in emergencies, mothers and babies in prison, the International Code, and infant feeding politics. Carol currently works as a policy analyst with the New Zealand College of Midwives. On a personal note, Carol was born in West Yorkshire, England, moved to New Zealand in 1975. She was inspired as an environmental activist by an older cousin in the 1970s in England. She had a career in theater and dance, performing, producing, stage managing, and choreography for children's and fringe theater in New Zealand, which is why she's such an expert speaker and teacher. So welcome, Carol. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nancy. It's very nice to be here. It's just at 7 a.m. in the morning from Christchurch in New Zealand. And I will just start sharing my screen in a moment. I try? No, yes. Okay. Okay, so I think we're all systems go. Can you all see the full slide?
Yeah. I'm seeing your PowerPoint. Oh.
Yes, good. That's great. So I will probably click to just because the lighting's not very good here. It's still very dark outside. I might just change myself to my photograph, if I can find it. If it's there, yes. Oh, have I got rid of everything? Oh, that's no good. Oh dear. Share. No, that's good. Okay, so I can't hear anybody anymore. Are you still there, Nancy? Am I still on?
Carol, this is Maricela. It looks like your slides forwarded and we don't have a screen view of your photo. So I think it's okay if you haven't loaded your photo as your virtual background or your
profile. Yes, I actually did do that. Let me just, I don't know why it's done that.
So now I see your picture and your slides are gone.
Yes, so it should still be there. Okay. Oh, but all right. So the host has stopped me doing that. That's okay. I'll go back to where I was then. Okay, and just keep on going, shall I? Okay. Okay. So let me go back to where I was, except and show. Go back to the beginning. Right, okay, so hopefully we're now at the beginning. Okay, so thank you very much again for inviting me to give this session today. Just a little bit of background. I live in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and as Nancy said before, I came to live here in 1975 from Bradford, West Yorkshire in England. And I just want to acknowledge the fact that I'm now fortunate to be living on the land of Ngāi Tahu, who are the principal Māori iwi, which means tribe of the South Island of New Zealand. And so the tribal area on which I'm fortunate enough to live is the largest one in New Zealand.
Sorry to interrupt, Carol, but we don't see your slides. I can't see your slides right now.
Oh, they're gone again. Okay, I'll try and go back. I don't know why that's happened. Okay, so I might have to just go right back to just a second. I don't know why that's not working. Okay, it was working before, wasn't it? Sorry, everybody. I'll just go back and if I can make that work again. Marisela. Back here. I don't know. Okay, let me go back onto full screen again and then go back into share screen and try again. Oh. So let's see how this is going. That's on now?
Yes, it is.
Oh, that's good. So this, you may not have seen it when I was saying that, but I'm very happy and pleased to live in New Zealand. And I live on the land of the Ngāi Tahu, who are the principal Māori iwi tribe who live in the South Island of New Zealand. That's working too, yes? Yep. Okay, so today I'm just going to have a sort of a quick romp really, because an hour isn't quite long enough. So through issues of climate change, big formula marketing and how that contributes, intensive dairy farming, water shortages and water issues, environmental degradation, looking at the significance of infant feeding decisions and also the barriers to breastfeeding and the inequity that's embedded in there. A little look at infant and young child feeding in emergencies, as of course that's very linked to what we're talking about today. And the sustainability of breastfeeding, which is what World Breastfeeding Week is about, looking at that whole zero carbon footprint, the shortest food mile, and green feeding. And then I'm going to talk about some things that may be useful to do. So some tentative solutions and thoughts about what I've been talking about. So can the extreme weather that we experience be blamed on climate change? Well, the research seems to suggest that it is linked. So climate change is now increasing the frequency and magnitude of many of these disastrous events that we're experiencing. Of course, in Christchurch, we had a lot of earthquakes, and there is evidence to suggest, Bill McGuire wrote a book called Waking the Giant, and said that there were clear signs now that human-induced climate change is waking the slumbering giant beneath our feet. And so in 2010 and 2011, I got my first-hand experience of infant feeding in disasters and emergencies when we had had very big earthquakes in Christchurch. So in 2010, the World Health Assembly said that one of the resolutions, they were concerned that in emergencies, many of which occur in countries that are not on track to attain what were then the Millennium Development Goals, particularly Goal 4, and which includes situations created by the effects of climate change, that infants and young children were particularly vulnerable to malnutrition, illness and death. And they also recognise that the national emergency preparedness plans and international responses do not always cover protection, promotion, support of optimal infant and young child feeding. And certainly when we had our earthquakes in Christchurch in 2020 and 2011, we really weren't prepared. Although interestingly, the year before, which was 2009, the World Breastfeeding Week theme was actually about infant and young child feeding in emergencies. And I remember at the time thinking, oh, this is interesting. I haven't really thought about this before. And then I started looking at it and started working to try and get our civil defence or our Ministry of Health to be interested in sort of putting something in place. And we never really managed to get there properly, hardly at all, in fact, until after the earthquakes. And then in I think it was 2012 or 13, the Ministry of Health has now put out some guidance on infant and young child feeding in emergencies, except it's not young child, it's just infants. So they only go to 1 year with their information. But it's a start that we're actually getting there. It's really good. So there are links between, of course, climate change and our mode of feeding, because it's such a huge thing. There's so many babies in the world, and the push of the marketing of formula has made a massive difference to a lot of those issues. So David Clark was interviewed in 2017 and talked about how it could also address climate change because it doesn't contribute to the depletion of natural resources. So this has been talked about for quite a long time. So this week, of course, it's World Breastfeeding Week, and we know that this is about supporting breastfeeding for a healthier planet. And this is a logo that you'd be very aware of, which is about informing people about the links, because just as the disasters have not been necessarily linked to climate change, pretty well the same thing, I think, apart from a small group of people in terms of infant feeding decisions and climate change and the environment. So it's the same sort of issue. It's not really, the agenda is there and people are talking about it, but they haven't really pulled in yet, in the mainstream anyway, to the links between infant feeding and climate change. And of course, anchoring breastfeeding, they say, is a climate smart decision, engaging with individuals and galvanizing action. So this is from the WABA page as well. The focus is on climate change, the impact of infant feeding on the environment, and the urgent need to protect, promote, and support breastfeeding. So because breastfeeding is breast milk is a natural renewable food that's environmentally safe. The recommendations for breastfeeding, I don't need to share these with you really, because I'm sure the next few slides you're all completely aware of as the San Diego County Breastfeeding Coalition. But the recommendations for breastfeeding haven't changed, despite what we occasionally see in the media and the threats to it from various pieces of research or pseudo research mostly. The recommendations remain the same for feeding infants and young children. It does make a massive difference, as we know, to hospitalizations and health. This is a study that came from the UK and looked at the breastfeeding duration and looked at reducing hospitalization, and it significantly made a difference. I think lots of places don't actually keep the data which can come out with these this sort of study. Certainly in New Zealand, we have admissions to pediatrics or GP, general practitioner visits, but we don't necessarily link them in our data collection with feeding. So we don't really have this data here, which is why I have to use other countries as well. And we know it's a public health priority globally. It's linked to a whole lot of non-communicable diseases. So it's pretty significant, as we know. And this was a slide from the Public Health Association Australia, and they said that natural disasters every year cause an additional 26 million to fall into poverty. So it's a pretty significant thing we're talking about today. So breastfeeding is important, and you know why. It's a public health priority, it's sustainability, and I think one of the things for me is that the majority of women do plan to breastfeed, they do want to breastfeed, but they stop breastfeeding before they're ready. And this to me is the most significant part of it in terms of what are women's intentions, do they meet their goals, how do they feel if they don't, and we know that the fallout from that is quite significant. So this is the area that I'm particularly interested in my work the most. So as the Lancet series on breastfeeding said, you know, success in breastfeeding is not the sole responsibility of a woman. The promotion of breastfeeding is the collective societal responsibility, in which I have to add in there, it's not just the promotion of breastfeeding, it's protection and support, which we should always add, of course, every time we talk about promotion, because promotion on its own is not okay, because it creates a climate that women feel that they should be breastfeeding in, and then they don't get supported and protected, and the breastfeeding isn't protected. So the final comment really from the Lancet was that the world is still not a supportive or enabling environment for most women who want to breastfeed. The impact of climate change on human health, this is a thing from the CDC, which is quite good, which looks at severe weather and air pollution, extreme heat, and all the things that it will affect. And I haven't put lots of slides on here today, but there is an increasing number of research studies which are looking at the effects on pregnant women and their pregnancies, and also children, infants, and it's certainly linked to a whole lot of things that happen for them, like lower birth weight, a whole lot of issues starting to emerge. So green feeding, which is an International Baby Food Action Network phrase that they use, which is about healthy and sustainable food, it starts with breastfeeding, which has a positive impact. So they have a lot of, I don't know if you've looked at the EBFEM pages or the GIFA pages, or they actually have got a whole lot of information now and papers looking at green feeding and what it means. So climate change, of course, as I said before, is linked to poverty, or to plunging people into poverty. And pregnant women, infants and young children are amongst the most vulnerable of populations in that sense. And they're not vulnerable on one level, but we are putting them into vulnerable situations, which I prefer to think of it that way rather than vulnerable people, which makes it sound that they've done something themselves. It's just that we plunge them into vulnerable situations. Women, of course, already suffer from a whole range of things which don't help, like gender inequity, poverty and marginalisation. And climate change effects will negatively impact maternal infant morbidity and mortality. And an old paper by Rylander considered that climate change is one of the biggest threats to achieving the global targets for maternal health. Maria Neira, in 2014, at the WHO, described climate change as a threat to the bottom line of sustainable development, human health. And Naomi Klein, in her book, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, suggested that capitalism is the reason behind climate change inaction, and describes how corporate interests have exploited disaster situations and turned them into business opportunities. And I think all of us listening today can see that we have similar situation in terms of infant feeding and how corporate interests have made a big difference to what happens in our respective countries. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which was 2018, said that climate-related risks to health, livelihoods, food security, water supply, and human security were projected to increase with a global warming of 1.5 degrees centigrade and further with 2 degrees. And then they looked at the inequity issue. And of course, the vulnerability to the health effects varies considerably depending on where you live and what actually happens. And I think we can see quite clearly, looking at COVID-19, which of course we're all living through at the moment, and some countries are living through a more extreme situation than others, that we are vulnerable depending on our demographics and our health system capacity and our government's action. So it's the same thing with climate change as COVID-19. So inequity of choice about method of feeding is an aspect of the dilemma that we're talking about, because choice in terms of infant feeding is a little bit of an illusion, because breastfeeding is out of reach for many women regardless of whether they plan to or wish to breastfeed. Grow Low in Canada looked at women who were poor French Canadian women and found that they lacked access to the power required to negotiate barriers to breastfeeding. And these can be a whole range of things, including having to go back to paid workforce and not being supported. Amy Brown from Swansea University found that women encounter numerous barriers to breastfeeding, and most of these are actually outside of maternal control. So she draws attention to that whole unconsidered often societal barriers that affect breastfeeding. I think by doing that, she destabilizes what I think is an unhelpful narrative about breastfeeding being about individual women's decisions and about women, if we only educated them enough, they would breastfeed. It's not actually helpful, I don't think. And that's why I think we have to be careful with our climate change and breastfeeding comments, because we don't want to alienate people, and we don't want to create more of a backlash against breastfeeding than we've already got. And I think Emma Pickett, who is a breastfeeding counsellor in England, she thought that the best message was support breastfeeding for a healthier planet, not breastfeed for a healthier planet, because it's a different way of framing it, but it's noticeable. So women don't necessarily have weak intentions. In Amy Brown's research, over 80% of women intended to breastfeed in the UK. But we do know that too few children benefit from appropriate breastfeeding practices. Of the 140 million live births in 2015, 77 million babies had to wait too long to be put to the breast. So we know that the research has shown, the data shows that infants are not being fed optimally. So looking at a global view of breastfeeding practices, this is from UNICEF, a publication. If the world was issued a global breastfeeding scorecard, it would receive a failing grade. Alison Stubag and Schwartz, they talked about infant feeding decisions significantly affecting mother-child outcomes, even in settings with clean water and good sanitation, which of course is one of the things that we also have to constantly remind people of, that it's not just in countries where there isn't clean water. We have issues, not maybe as many, but we certainly have issues in countries where they do have clean water. And even countries with majority of clean water have areas where they don't have clean water. So we have to consider all of those. So we have a rise in demand and consumption of dairy products. And of course, in New Zealand, I come from the land of a lot of cows. We used to be a land of a lot of sheep. I think we used to have, I think per population, something like 2 sheep per person. I think we might be up to 4 cows per person now. And the sheep have definitely faded into the background, which is a shame because of course sheep are much less polluting than cows. But we've got onto this absolute trajectory of completely rising to a so-called demand. And sometimes the demand is not actually demand, but it's manufactured. I think one of the things in the playbook of marketing is that you seduce people and you scare people, like you scare people into thinking that breastfeeding isn't as good and so they should use formula, and you give them misleading information. So we are, the demand is not necessarily a demand that's a genuine demand, it's a created demand. So Fonterra, who was a dairy giant in New Zealand, they said that by 2020, which of course here we are now, they said this in 2007, that developed countries will be consuming 32 million tons more of milk products than they did in the late 90s. But that rise will be dwarfed by demand in developing countries, which will consume 170 million more tons more. And we've certainly seen this happening, particularly in countries like China, Vietnam, the Philippines. So Greenpeace New Zealand looked at Fonterra. So it's not just about sending milk powder. We're using a lot of palm-based animal feed, importing palm kernel, which is completely unsustainable and is linked to deforestation and global gas emissions. We've got dairy intensification and fertilizer use, which is a real problem, and we're polluting our rivers and streams. It's using coal, over 400,000 tonnes a year at dairy processing. And even though at the moment what we're seeing is a little bit of what I would call greenwashing. Some of the bigger dairy factories are talking about going out of coal. It's sort of not the only issue. There's a lot more issues than just coal. And of course, deforestation, as we've said before. And the majority of this is for dairy conversions. This was in 2020. Shefali Sharma wrote how big dairy is heating up the planet and hollowing rural communities. And they said that the way forward is to redirect, regulate, and regenerate. And I think that, yes, absolutely. And without regulation, we won't get anywhere. And certainly where I come from, we have a regulation phobia. Nothing really happens. So we tend to have our Infant Nutrition Council, which is the marketing group for Australia and New Zealand, a self-regulated organisation who represent formula companies. And they not only self-regulate, and they also write their own rules. So our international code in New Zealand is actually called the Code in New Zealand. And so it actually, part of the code in New Zealand is what the infant formula companies say is the code. So we don't really have the code, the international code per se in New Zealand. It's just unregulated. And you don't actually even have to join the Infant Nutrition Council as a formula company. So there is no compulsion to join them or not. Although it's not a good look not to join them. Quite a few companies don't join. So looking at one of the major issues, and it's one of the major issues that I'm interested in, which is the degradation of our water. I'm constantly concerned that it's a major problem. Dr. Mike Joy, he's a senior lecturer and a freshwater ecologist. He's written quite a lot about this, and from 2015 or earlier than that onwards. And when you look at the true cost of milk, and I'm sure you'll find it in most places, but particularly in New Zealand, we have a problem. The environmental deterioration versus profit of the dairy industry. And what you find when you look at this is that because you have to use so many externally sourced inputs like fertilizer, feed, supplements, and irrigation, this doesn't actually, it's not looked at when you look at profit. But the other issue is that the environmental externalities, which are the impact on the land, the water, etc., these are not paid for by the dairy industry. So we, the public, have to deal with the externalities, so we pay for them. So we have end up having an economic responsibility, and the environmental degradation is caused by companies that are not, but by farms that actually are not doing anything about it. So that the study that they looked at, Keisha Foot and Mike Joy, what they found was that the economic cost of environmental externalities was higher than the 2012 dairy export revenue. So there is no profit for some people. And given that it takes 800 litres of water to make a single litre of milk, we are squandering our water in more ways than one. So this is a picture that appears in other countries. In China, this is from China, I think, which makes it look like we have this ridiculously green, lots of little lumpy hills, clean green New Zealand. And so we market our products on this particular mantra, but we're not really clean and green anymore. We have a lot of significant ecological damage because of too many cows. And some areas where are never meant to have cows have now got cows, And so it's really not working without a lot of irrigation, and a lot of irrigation causes a massive problem as well. And nitrates are going into our rivers, etc., and causing growth in our rivers, which are killing fish, and on it goes. So these are from Mike Joy's study. It just shows that he calls it 100% pure delusion rather than 100% clean and green. Yes. But I had to show this after I've shown that photo, because we are still a beautiful place, but our environment is seriously under threat, as is our water safety. We've also got lots of problems with positive E. coli tests in our drinking water. Now at the moment in Christchurch, where we had the most amazing water supply, our aquifers, it was just extraordinary. Now we've got chlorine in our water because of all the pollution that's going on. So it's one of the things that is distressing a lot of people. I'm very distressed by it, and it's a very slow fix. One of the things about nitrates, of course, is that once you get them into your aquifer, which we haven't got yet, nitrates are appearing in some small bores on farms, but not generally for the major population. Once you actually get nitrates into your aquifer, as far as I'm aware, it's very hard, if not impossible, to get it out. And of course, nitrates in water, if someone is formula feeding and using water, is linked to blue baby syndrome, as you probably all know. So our rivers, they're polluted, they're drained, and they're drying out. This is from 2020, from April, and the latest environmental report shows the terrible state of our freshwater ecosystems. And climate change will exacerbate it. And at the same time, of course, what's happening is that our intensification of dairy is putting a lot of pressure on our environment. And this picture here that you can see, that river, that's called a braided river. And it's a particularly important kind of river in Canterbury, where I come from, because we're the only place with braided rivers. And braided rivers are amazing important ecologically, because those areas where the river isn't are where a lot of rare birds do nest and breed. So there's a lot of, the braided rivers are amazing from the air. So the conversation, and I had a wee look to see, and you do have a US conversation. The one in Australia and New Zealand is pretty good. And if you're an academic, you can get really good articles into the conversation, which I think can make them a lot more accessible to the general public. So I think if you've got any access to the conversation in the US, starting some writing, if you work in an academic institution, is a really good way of getting messages out there. It's just completely brilliant. So this is a new one that I found about climate change, and how our glaciers are shrinking, our soils are drying out, our water is polluted, our freshwater species are under threat, etc. So climate change is affecting freshwater, as is our dairy farming. So this is on your slide, so I'm not going to talk about it anymore, but we've got a lot of issues going on, really. So this is a conversation US. I found it on Twitter. As you can see, I haven't followed it yet, but I probably will, just to see all of you writing, all of you academic people in America writing for it. So it's a really good way of getting it into the public eye. So water pollution is our #1 concern in a new poll in 2019. And of course, in America, I've been looking to try and sort of make it relevant for you as well. And there's, of course, a lot of concern about climate change rising there. And in April, I found this little news story which said that US concern about climate change is rising, but mainly among Democrats. So the majority of American cities said the federal government is not doing enough. And this is just a little graph at the side, which looks at what people are concerned about, which is really good, from the Pew Research Center. So this is from October 2019. And these findings, of course, as you're all very aware of, come amid ongoing efforts to roll back your regulations designed to protect the environment. So it's a massive threat. China, they've got giant cow farms there too, because of course they're trying to reduce the need for importing formula, and they want to make their own, so they're getting giant cow farms now as well. So dairy milk powder is a major component of milk powder. Greenhouse gas emissions are really significant, and the greenhouse gas emissions attributable to milk powder is significantly higher than for other dairy products because of the additional process and energy used during manufacture. So you could think of infant formula as being the first ultra-processed food that an infant has. And this data comes from that report on carbon footprint due to milk powder, which came out in 2015. So irrigated dairy farms use nearly double the electricity. They use more nitrogen fertilizer, 135 kilograms per hectare compared to 68 for non-irrigated. So the carbon footprint of formula is actually quite big. And so this is again from the carbon footprint due to milk powder study. And this is how much formula is sold every year in the study countries. They looked at China, Malaysia, Philippines, India, South Korea, and Australia. And the maximum increase in sale is for toddler formula, which I suppose makes it even more distressing, because we know that toddler formula and indeed follow-on formula or follow-up formula are both unnecessary products. So if you look at the toddler formula sales, 89.2% increase, which is definitely, this is 2015, but it's definitely been borne out in what I've seen in the rise of toddler formula. And certainly on our televisions now, where we do have advertising for formula, we haven't seen, of course, the first one advertised for a very long time. And the follow-on ones have disappeared off the screen as well. And they're all actually for toddler formula now, because that's the growing market. So the average emissions, greenhouse gas emissions for different categories, what they found in studies is that the toddler milk is creating more of the greenhouse gas emissions. So support for breastfeeding is an environmental imperative. Formula contributes to environmental degradation and climate change. And yeah, this is a study from, it's in your references at the end of your paper. And the production of unnecessary infant and toddler formulas exacerbates environmental damage. So Save the Children estimated that global fund management firms have 110 billion invested in milk formula companies, and the profits are fueled by marketing practices that directly and profoundly harm children. They also note that shareholder activism, responsible investment, and attention to environmental impact could change corporate practices. Yes, but I do think that, and of course this would increase very overdue industry accountability, but I do think that without regulation, it won't happen. It's just not going to happen, because the primary responsibility of a business is to make money for the shareholders. So it's unlikely that even shareholder activism, there would be enough shareholder activism to shift it without some government regulation. So it brings me to just a couple of slides, because of course all this that we're talking about is completely linked to what happens in emergencies and disasters. And of course, the most sustainable way of feeding is breastfeeding. Food security is completely linked to breastfeeding, and safety in emergencies is linked to breastfeeding also, because even though formula feeding may have been safe-ish in times of not emergency and disaster, it certainly becomes unsafe in disaster situations. As Marion Kelly said, contrary to what was widely believed, the Gulf War had little impact on women's ability to breastfeed. What did change was the level of risk associated with formula feeding. So access to clean water and ways of hygiene for making up bottles, access to products, although of course one of the first things that happens in emergencies, in my experience in New Zealand, is that alongside the civil defence response, the infant formula companies are immediately flooding you with products, which is what happened here. And we were still seeing products around 2 years after the earthquake. Now we have something in place to stop that happening, that our Ministry of Health has put into place. We haven't actually tested it yet to see if it does work. But now they no longer can do this, what they did before. I mean, I found products being sold on Trade Me 2 years later, actually sold, because there were so many big boxes of mostly toddler formula that were flooded our city. So I think the simple fact sheets about lots of things can be useful. I think simple fact sheets about the link between infant feeding and climate change is really good. Just remembering that we should be saying support breastfeeding for a healthier planet rather than breastfeed for a healthier planet. So these are, I made some sheets so I did some work on infant feeding in emergencies. And what I find is that in emergency areas, the people don't really understand about feeding, unless you can get people there who are peer counsellors or infant feeding, people who work in infant feeding. It's very difficult. So access to information is key. Access before a disaster, of course, is much better than during a disaster. And we need to link disasters to climate change, and we need to think about the importance of food security. And in terms of poverty and areas where access to food is difficult, we need to think about breastfeeding as providing food security for young infants, young babies. And of course, I think food sovereignty is the key thing as well, because food sovereignty to me is where we should be going, like supporting people to grow their own things or to access their own food rather than being in a food desert. But of course, breastfeeding is food sovereignty, totally, like women taking back their own power, as it were. It's almost like an act of resistance, given the amount of marketing and what women and the barriers that women actually face to getting breastfeeding going. So there's a lot of things go on in the background. We've had some really interesting papers looking at, from New Zealand academics, looking about New Zealand and how they are flooding other countries with milk powder for formula. And Judith Galtree, who was an academic in New Zealand, she wrote this in the Journal of Human Lactation in 2013. And she said that even if New Zealand, if we're looking at, I mean, all our maternity facilities are now baby-friendly, hospital accredited. We haven't got baby-friendly communities going so much, but we do have quite a few contracts in different regions which are for breastfeeding advocacy. So we've got some things. We may not have the whole international code into law or regulation. In fact, we haven't at all. But there is action in that area. But so we're doing all this, but then we're quite happy to send a whole lot of stuff to other countries. So what she talked about in this particular paper was, what about our responsibility for other places? Do we care about the children in China? Do we care about the children in Vietnam? And one of the things that happened around this time or just before was that WikiLeaks exposed a whole lot of things that some people didn't notice, but they did expose efforts by US diplomats and corporations which were urging Asian leaders to halt breastfeeding promotion. So it's actually very interesting that the dairy industry is caught up in these sort of global infant formula wars. And I suspect that most farmers, dairy farmers, have got no idea of these issues really in the other countries. So these things are definitely going on in the background. As we know from the World Health Assembly resolution, which I have a slide about a little bit further along, the US did block a significant one, which somehow made it into the media much more than usual. This happens at every meeting, looking at codex, looking at decisions about the World Health Assemblies. They're often blocked by the US and other countries. So this is not unusual. So global warming, this is from 2016, but I thought it was interesting, and I think it would have changed now. This is looking at people, there's only just over 1,000 people that they looked at, but they looked whether people were alarmed or dismissive. And you can see that in the dismissive, doubtful, and disengaged, it's still a significant number. Some people were cautiously thinking that maybe there was an issue, but the concerned and alarmed were quite low. I'd be interested to see what this data looks like now that we're much further along from 2016. This is about willingness to join a campaign from the same research by the Six Americas segment. So the alarmed and concerned, I probably would do it. I definitely would do it. Was looking quite good in terms of joining a campaign. So I'd like to see the data, as I say, to see what it looks like now. I'm sure it's higher. So this is interesting. It's a new article. It's about time to wake up, climate change advocacy in a polarized Congress, 1996 to 2015. And this article is entitled "The Surprising Reasons Why People Ignore the Facts About Climate Change." And what they did find here was that Democrats tended to make arguments about climate change backed up by facts and evidence, while Republicans tend to tell stories and use imagery and emotional appeals and humor. And the thing that's interesting here is that these are ways of communicating. They're very effective. And I know myself, in terms of education, there's nothing like a good narrative story to actually make people or give people the opportunity to understand and remember what you're talking about. So stories and imagery do make a big difference in terms of being effective. So if you back up your facts and evidence with a good story about something, then it does make a difference. So because infant feeding is political and closely tied to governments of powerful countries in terms of the sales of breast milk and export and trading, sometimes it seems like those of us who are quite poorly resourced, like midwives, and even though we've got contracts for breastfeeding now in New Zealand, they're still poorly resourced. I think the Latia League New Zealand, who've done an amazing amount of work, of course, all around the world, including in America, where it started, they get $18,000 for the whole year for the whole of New Zealand from the Ministry of Health. So I would say that's under-resourced or poorly resourced. So we're often seen as being quite pesky. And we were actually, there has been accusations under a different government to the one that we have now, that in a way we were like economic terrorists because we were trying to damage our export market by talking about these things. And that's what Mike Joy, who I showed you a slide from earlier on, who's the ecologist and activist, he's often accused of like a treasonable sort of thing in terms of what he's saying. So we should all pretend that New Zealand is clean and green and it's all fabulous, but of course we can't. So the unfortunate result of this lack of protection and support for these voluntary agencies is that women and babies do end up being a collateral damage. So we have less than optimal exclusive breastfeeding rates, and women stop breastfeeding earlier than they planned. And then we have that associated negative mental health impact that I talked about earlier. So this is just going back to what we talked about before and all these influences in the background. So Natalie Shanker talked about what happened when the US blocked the resolution. So the Trump administration opposed the motion, which was about supporting breastfeeding. This resolution did have something about the code in there, but it was very, very, very mild. So what actually happened in the end was that Trump opposed a motion. They threatened Ecuador, who proposed it, with a suspension of trade and military support. And then ultimately, the motion was proposed by Russia and accepted. But what happened, but it was actually considerably watered down. But the behavior of the US apparently caused ripples of surprise and concern through the global public health community. And as I said before, it's interesting that it happened then because it's been happening for years. And this is what the WikiLeaks thing was talking about. They talked particularly about the Philippines in that one, where the Philippines were trying to strengthen their milk code. And what they were doing, but they were threatened by the US, and they said that their country's reputation for a stable place for investment would be threatened. So this is what actually happened. So this former industry lobbying was the background reason for the US decision, because there's a big turnover, 70 billion US dollars, and 60 million was spent lobbying the US government in the last decade. So there's a lot of contact between our governments and lobbyists for the industry. Marion Nestle, who I really like, professor in America, New York University, also wrote about this too. And she said that high on the list of significant and technical trade barriers are the breastfeeding policies of other countries. And this is because there's a concern from industry that breastfeeding rates may increase when governments implement policies, which of course they would do, if we looked at the whole, all the barriers to breastfeeding that women experience, and we dealt with that, like looked at longer paid, really well paid maternity leave, and we looked at breastfeeding friendly workplaces and early childhood education, etc. So when you put these in, it would make a difference, but there will be resulting rebound negative effect on infant formula sales. So that is the issue. So blocking these resolutions is part of the industry playbook. And of course, the more that we do this, the more we actually have this link up to climate change, and the more we degrade our environment, etc., etc. So it's all completely linked. I don't know if you saw this recently, but this started apparently in 2014, but it's really just come to light more now, that Nestle and Danone, being the two biggest offenders, as it were using social media even more than they had been before. So now they're actually recruiting mom-ambassadors. So every year, women between 21 and 35 years are encouraged to become brand ambassadors and actually start being a big social media presence. And they're invited on a 3-day trip to
Carol, we can't hear you. This is Nancy. I'm sorry for the interruption. We will try to get Carol back just as soon as we can.
Are we back?
We're back.
All right, so I'm not sure when I actually dipped out. Do you know? Was it on this slide?
We don't see your slides right now.
Oh, they've gone again. Oh, okay, sorry. Something seemed to happen. I went offline and I'm not quite sure why. Let's try it again.
It was the government, Carol. It was the
I know,
lobbyists.
it is. I think you might be right. Okay, let's have a look at this. let's go back to where we are with here, go back to slides, and then you have to tell me where I actually got to.
Okay. We do have one question while you're getting your slides up.
Okay.
That is, what proportion of global milk production goes into the manufacture of infant and toddler formulas?
Sorry, I'm just getting, I'll do this. It's much easier than going back out of here. Sorry. Let me just get to where I'm going. Sorry about this on your screen. I hope no one's having a...
No, keep
Okay,
going.
so, you know, tell me where I got to before I went offline.
Keep going.
There?
No,
There? There.
there.
There. Okay. The actual amount in terms of tons and things, I think there's a couple of things I said before, but I'm not sure what the actual amount is now. But there is a lot of, if you look on the IFFAN site or the India BPNI, they've got all the latest data there.
Okay.
If that's helpful.
Would you have a guess as to the proportion of milk production, of global milk production that goes into formulas?
You mean as opposed to going into other things?
Right.
Well, I think it's certainly for New Zealand, it's the majority of the milk powder goes out to formula. And I don't really know about other countries per se. But I think it's, I think the biggest countries really producers are, Ireland as well. So they're producing a lot of milk powder, which of course was the thing that actually buoyed up the Irish economy quite a number of years ago. I don't think they're quite in the same place now, but because Danone opened lots of factories in Ireland, and of course the Irish breastfeeding rates were already low at that particular time. So milk powder was a big, significant part of it there, but I'm not sure of the exact number. Sorry, I can find out there and send it to you.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Yep. Sure.
Please
Now,
continue.
so was I on this one? Yeah. So I think so we've got to return infant feeding issues to the climate change, environmental protection agenda. We have to diversify out of our infant feeding world because often we're not listened to, even though we might have data, research, evidence, and we have no conflict of interest in that we're not making money out of what we're doing. Sometimes we're not listened to. So I found that if I diversify out of where I'm working and join like environmental groups like Forest and Bird or like Greenpeace, they can get really involved in it too. And sometimes the message coming from somebody else has more impact. If you're able to have any influence in policy documents, what we're finding in New Zealand, and I've certainly seen evidence of this in things I've read from other countries, breastfeeding is completely dropped off the agenda. So if you look at now, they sometimes refer to nutrition and the importance of nutrition in the first 1,000 days, but they don't actually mention breastfeeding. So one of the things is getting breastfeeding back into documents that are policy. There's so many big reports come out in New Zealand now where breastfeeding isn't even mentioned. So whether that's by design or just because the people that know about that are not in those forums, I'm not sure, but it's time to get those back in. We do have to pay attention to what's going on internationally and the trade agreements and what's going on in the background. One of the things that you can do is make official information act requests. I don't know what it's called in the US, but in England, they did this and they found that there was a significant number of meetings held between the infant formula industry and the government, the health department, the government. So you can get that information. So that's a lot more. I think it was 17 meetings that they'd had in the period that they looked at, which was less than a year. So there's a lot of activity goes on in the background that we don't actually even know about. We have to fight, I think, to protect human rights treaties and frameworks, because I think that watching governments try to water down human rights treaties does indicate that they think they're a hindrance. So certainly I've seen this in the UK, that they're trying to do that. So I think it's good to always frame what we're talking about in a human rights framework. It's very easy to do that. You look at the UNCROC, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. You look at CEDAW, which is about discrimination against women, and just most of the human rights documents will talk about protecting motherhood and childhood and the best possible standard of health. And there are a couple of mentions of breastfeeding in there, so it's good to use those. We have to pass on good information carefully. Like I think the peer counsellor model works well if you've got peer counsellors that are supported and they have continuing education. I think that support breastfeeding for a healthier planet rather than breastfeed for a healthier planet is the way that I'd like to see that go. And we have to continue to protect, promote and support breastfeeding with emphasis on support and protection. This is just an example of how many things that you can follow and join in and put things in. So Twitter, I think, is a great forum for disseminating information. If you can get lots of followers, it's amazing how much action's on there. This is what I talked about before. The all-party parliamentary group on infant feeding and inequalities is in the UK. I mean, I can't even imagine at the moment how we would get something like this here, but this is where that information came from, about all meetings between the health department and the industry, because it was asked at a parliamentary meeting. There's lots of documents about climate justice through breastfeeding, sensitizing policymakers to the ecological footprint of formula, etc. And also we've got World Breastfeeding Trends Initiative, which we haven't got in New Zealand yet, but the Australian, which is our closest place, they had a report card in 2018, which didn't do very well. They got 25.5 because they're not really very far ahead with baby friendly either. But in here, there's a whole lot of things like the code and maternity protection, and lots of things that are linked to what we're talking about. Infant and young child feeding in emergencies. So that's all in there. So the total score they got out of 150 was 25.5. And of course, there are more countries joining in with this WBTI initiative now, which means that we get a bigger picture of what's going on in the world. We know that Sustainable Development Goals are linked to breastfeeding. WABA links them all 17 to breastfeeding. But unfortunately, of course, in the SDGs, again, it's another example of where breastfeeding is not. So they don't specifically mention breastfeeding. But of course, the links are evidence-based and clear. So we have to make them and we have to get them out there. In New Zealand, we have a Climate and Health Council. I've joined them. I do quite a bit of work with them. They're very medical focused, and most of the health professionals in there are doctors. So it's great to get some midwives in there, and they're really good at submissions. And if you can get breastfeeding, if you're involved with if you have a Climate and Health Council, you can start to put breastfeeding and infant feeding on the agenda. There's Joint Calls for Action, which is the College of Midwives we've joined in, which is great. So we were one of the signatories, and we also called for urgent climate action at the College of Midwives at the International Confederation of Midwives meeting in Prague quite a number of years ago, in recognition of the serious consequences of climate change globally, and to draw attention to the effects on women, birth, infants and families. So coming to the end now, anyone who believes that exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is a madman or an economist. And my favourite, E.F. Schumacher, in his study of economics, As If People Mattered, said that nothing makes economic sense unless its continuance for a long time can be projected without running into absurdities. So I heard Schumacher speak in the early 70s when I was quite young, and it was a significant, important moment for me. So he talks about what's economic and what's uneconomic. And he says that economic growth may be pathological, unhealthy, disruptive or destructive. And I think what we're seeing now is this whole growth thing is the thing that we're actually up against and fighting. And as lots of people have said before, in the US and everywhere, COVID-19 is actually presenting us with a way possibly of looking at, it's highlighted the inequities even more than before. And we need to look at how we can move forward and retain some of the things that were good or which worked, without going straight back to the model that we're working on before, which of course is pathological, unhealthy, disruptive and destructive. So broad scale activities are non-sustainable. If we ignore the costs, they're not economic. And so ultimately they and us will not exist. So as Naomi Klein said, our economic model is at war with life on Earth, and the climate movement has still yet to find its full moral voice, but it's clearing its throat. Well, I think that we've been clearing our throats for a long time now, and lactation and breastfeeding are of compelling evolutionary significance, and they deserve recognition as strong links to the wellness, sustainability and survival of our planet, and as much more than just the optimal means to feed an infant. So breastfeeding women deserve all the support, protection and attention we can give them. So this is a little picture at the end, and it's artwork by a midwife who was a student midwife at the time, and she did this wonderful poster, and she put it up on the wall, so it was like street art. So it was up there for quite a few months, and then she gave it to us because, as Nancy said before, I was intimately involved, and Nancy came to New Zealand quite a number of years ago, and I was lucky enough to be able to take her to the neonatal intensive care unit here, where she gave a talk about donor milk and donor milk banking. And I've been working for quite a number of years at that point on trying to get a donor milk bank going in the neonatal unit, because we didn't have any in New Zealand. And so Nancy came along and spoke as well. And then a few years later, I managed to get to the point where we got a committee for a milk bank, and we've now got one open. And since then, I've been working on the Rotary Community Milk Bank, which is a community-based milk bank. And this is we were given this piece of art for our community milk bank. So now Christchurch is the only place in New Zealand with milk banking. So now the next two slides. So thank you very much. Those are my email addresses. They're actually on your handout as well. And you will see the references on the handout also. And I will stop sharing now because it's probably time for some questions, possibly, is it?
Yes, we do. We have a few more.
I'll try and put myself on screen. Let's see. Oh, I can't start my video because you stopped. I think you've included me on the,
okay.
It doesn't matter. You can, if you want to see me, you can. You have to change the setting.
Okay, all right. Okay, so we don't have any additional questions right now, but if you have one, you can put it in the Q&A box or in the chat, in the Q&A box or chat box. I'm going to share my screen right now.
And Nancy, I'm very happy if questions come in the next week or so. You can just direct them to me and I will send you an email.
Okay. Maricela, can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Let me see here. Okay. Well, thank you all for attending our webinar. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we
can.
Great. We are and thank you, Carol, for again a superb presentation, and thank you, Maricela, for helping out. If there's any additional questions for Carol, please send them. You can send them to us at sccbc@breastfeeding.org or send them directly to Carol at her email. And please bear with us as we try to integrate and streamline all the webinar components to make the process easier for you and seamless and more efficient on our side. We're learning. You will receive an email with instructions on accessing a brief evaluation, and your certificate after the evaluation form is filled out. Your certificate will be emailed to you. And we hope to see you again at our webinars every Saturday in August and the first Saturday in September. Our next webinar is 1 week from today at 10 a.m. and it's on relactation, which is important, especially in the COVID-19 crisis, and that will be Carolina Ochoa. And our Liquid Gold Gala for the Breastfeeding Coalition is going virtual. It still will be October 3rd, but it will be virtual, and we'll send you information on that shortly. So thank you all. If you have any other questions, please email them to us at the Coalition or to Carol directly.
We did have one question come in if we have time.
Okay. Yes, we do. Go ahead.
Is there any movement? Yes. Is there any movement in South America that supports Green World and breastfeeding that you know of?
Yes, I think so. There's a very active International Baby Food Action Network group in South America. So there will be quite a lot of work going on there via IBFAN. I'm not sure about with anybody else, but IBFAN certainly have quite a strong base there. And of course, there's lots of, and Brazil, of course, have lots of milk banks. So there's some quite positive things that go on down there. Although, of course, at the moment, there's lots of changes. So, yeah, so the only thing I know is that the International Baby Food Action Network is very active.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Not at this moment.
Carol?
Thank you.
I'm allowing you to go home and go back and take a nap, okay?
Thank you.
And thank you to all our participants. We'll see you at the next webinar. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.